This is Notorious POD, the podcast for the best informed people in the real estate industry. Rob Hahn is your host, and Notorious is where the real estate industry comes for real talk with no bullshit.
Hey everybody, welcome to a Musings. I started writing a post actually to talk about this, and then I decided, you know what, I've written about this before, I've certainly talked about it before, and I needed to do a Musings anyway, so I figured I'd do that on this. So what is the this? My good friend Sam DeBoard, who is the CEO of Reso, recently put out a pretty lengthy Twitter thread where he proposed, I don't know if you could say he proposed creating it, but he certainly pointed out the value of trying to create what he calls a distributed public universal property information network. And now I know Sam's also been on this deep journey, the same one I went through, and I'm still in the midst of, around kind of the application of blockchain to real estate. And the most obvious place for that, I think, is using the blockchain to record property information, record title information. And I remember I've written posts in the past. I think my very first post about this was in 2019. In fact, let me pull that stuff up. Let's see here, so we can talk about it. Yeah. So first of all, this is the thread that that Sam put out, and I did a thread reader unroll because it's 22 parts. It's really good, and I think if you follow Sam, he's at Sam DeBoard. Go on Twitter, check it out. He really put some thought into it. And I think he makes some really, really good points. But I've written about how title and blockchain is it's the most obvious application, but it's also the most difficult. I felt like it really was a bit of a barking up the wrong tree, not because of technology, not because of us, but because of government. All right. So since he put this out, I thought, all right, let's go through it. Let's have this conversation again. I feel like this is how we push the ball forward. I'm taking his suggestions very seriously, and let's go through it. All right. So I can't really highlight on this, but I will try to make it a little bit larger. Let's see. All right. So what is he proposing? A distributed public universal property information network. And the reason to do it, as he put it, up to 25% of properties have errors in their chain of title. I'm just going to take him at his word for that. Because it is what it is. You would think that title insurance would have corrected a lot of that over time. But hey, whatever. And the second part, though, is true. These, quote, public records can be difficult to access in a consistent, timely manner because the government agencies that produce title records, the land registry offices, at least in the United States, some of them are really backwards. I mean, we're talking filing cabinets, going back to like the 1690s, maybe microfiche. I mean, really ancient technology, right? So, read the whole thing. But basically, what he's suggesting is that some group of organizations that have some vested interest in having much more accurate title information, much more accurate property information, record onto a blockchain in a distributed node fashion so that everyone would have a copy of it and so on. Okay. And, there's a whole lot of other stuff. He goes through a protective data provider model, altruistic data provider model, and then he does deal with this, what about the government? So clearly most local governments are not going to be moving quickly towards recording on crypto, blockchain, distributed ledger. Success of this model is dependent on government participation. In fact, its production becomes a check on or for government agencies. A repository of vast historical information allows citizens and government employees to ensure that new recordings are correct. Okay, let's just take it from there for now, the very first sort of idea behind it. I don't think this really works, right? Because, and I can't remember where I wrote it up. I think I talked about it here. But, but let me see if I could try and explain this as clearly and simply as I could. So what is title, if you think about it, right? What's land registry? It's just a record somewhere that says that I own a piece of property, right? There's a title deed recorded essentially that says Rob owns 1-3 Main Street. Okay. What's the impact of that recording? In other words, it's we got to go a step beyond and say, okay, we have this title information. What exactly does it do? Sure, it allows for commercial uses. I could go get a mortgage. I could go get a HELOC on my house. Before I do that, the bank's going to want to know, do you own this thing, right? Because we're going to give you a loan against your equity. We need to make sure you have some equity. So they need to know that you own it. Um, but that's only the surface level, right? Because really what the title registry, what title means is that you would win in a dispute, right? So if I say I own 1-3 Main Street, somebody comes along and says, no, you don't. I own 1-3 Main Street. Or what is probably more common is say, you might own 1-3 Main Street, but I own some property right on your land, like maybe an easement, or maybe I assert claims to the sewer pipes for whatever reason, right? Some weird shit that goes on, right? What happens then? Right? In other words, I say I own it. Somebody else says, no, you don't. Or you don't all of it. Or there's a dispute over boundaries or what have you. What happens? What happens? You have to take it to court, right? I mean, we live in a civilized, law-based society, so it's not like, my neighbor and I are going to get in a shootout to figure out who actually owns what. We're going to take it to court. So we take it to court, and I produce some document, the title record that says I own this. He has to produce some document that says, no, you don't, or I own this easement. And then the court's gonna have to go figure out where exactly everything is, bring in people, witnesses, whatever, do whatever it takes. All right. So the issue with all of this sort of title on the blockchain, as amazing as wonderful as it is, and as sort of sensible, it's just like the most obvious thing to do. Where I start, maybe because I do have a legal background, and say, what will a court do? Right. So let's say this, Sam's kind of, property information, the blockchain is created. Cool. And he says it's meant to be a check against government agencies. Okay, cool. What does that mean? If the information on this blockchain property information repository is different than what's in the government land registry, how will a court handle that? Right. My take on it is I can't imagine a scenario where the court would take the information in a private network over the information in the government registry, unless you could have somebody from the government registry or someone compelling come up and say, yeah, that land registry record is wrong, right? uh, in fact, here's a conviction of the clerk, of the county clerk, for falsifying land registry records, right? Therefore, what's in the county deed registry is wrong. We should accept the information in this private network over that. It would have to take something like that, in my opinion, and it would have to be a consistent thing, or some sort of judicial ruling, some sort of, I don't know, some sort of precedent-setting ruling that says if there's a conflict between what's in the government records and what's in this private property information network, the private property information network wins. So court would then rule in your favor because you have the property information records, even though the land registry says something else. I have a lot of difficulty accepting that political reality absent legislation. I just, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there are all sorts of crypto savvy, blockchain friendly judges, all over the country. I just can't imagine it. I just can't. So until we have some lawsuit that does set that precedent, I feel like any sort of private information network, sure, you could set it up for other values, maybe something other than proof of title, proof of ownership, resolving those disputes. But otherwise, what's the value, right? In other words, if you have two versions of truth, but one's going to get enforced by the courts and with men with guns, and the other one is not, what's the value? Even if you are doing, let's say, you want to use for commercial purpose. So take the example I just gave of, I want to get a second mortgage. I want to get a HELOC. So I go to the bank and I say, here's property information that says I own it with no encumbrances. Was the bank going to accept that? Or are they going to say, that's cool, but we're going to need to see the government records? Because push comes to shove, if there's some lawsuits, there's a dispute, we're going to need to take this to court. And we need to know that the judge is going to accept whatever evidence we produce as truth, as fact, as opposed to something else. So I don't see the real value, I guess. Of course, there's efficiency. There's Sam is absolutely right that the existing government registries, government offices are awful. I mean, but that's it's like going to the DMV. That's pretty awful, and yet we haven't done anything with it. Technology has not made a dent in the DMV process, not really. Um, and I kind of feel like it's the same thing. So until we see some political change, until we see some change in the legislative or regulatory environment, I'm not really sure what the value of putting any title or property information on a blockchain actually is, right? But um, let's just say that there's, give it sort of steel man the argument, right? Yeah, okay, but this universal property information thing isn't meant to be used for dispute resolution. It's just meant to make access to data easier, right? So, in other words, let me pull this up again. All right. In other words, as he put it, additional data could provide context to public records. Consumers professionals will be able to view multi-producer historical information about real property to make more educated, data-driven decisions. And the idea, I suppose, is that what's in the public records is incomplete. It's missing a lot of information. And a lot of that information is useful to consumers and to real estate agents, to appraisers, to inspectors, what have you, right? So step to the next thing where it talks about how historical public records needs to be aggregated and new data needs to be collected going forward, not rocket science. One of my criticism with this sentence is it's very passive. Right? Historical records need to be aggregated. I would try to make it an active voice, right? Who is doing this aggregation? Because today, title companies have done this aggregation, right? Big title. So First American, Fidelity, Black Knight, Stewart Title, like these multi-billion-dollar corporations have spent years, decades doing the public data aggregation. They have networks, thousands of people going to the county clerk's office to do the data aggregation. So if we just do that sentence to say, title companies need to aggregate historical public records and put it into this public information repository written onto a blockchain. Stop right there. Why would they do that? I mean, these people have built multi-billion-dollar businesses on top of aggregating pain in the ass to get public records data. Are they going to just donate that? I don't see that. So perhaps they license it, right? Which is what they do today. But if they're licensing it, putting it onto a public blockchain doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? Because then it's public. You can go get it. You have copies in your own individual nodes. And then the new data needs to be collected going forward. It's like there's a person missing. Like, who needs to aggregate new data, right? So who is collecting new data going forward and putting it into this repository? Let's name them. Like, are we talking real estate agents? Are we talking MLSs? Who's doing this aggregation, right? Is it the government? I mean, who's doing this? It's clearly not the government, because then we're just talking about title and land registry on the blockchain, which is holy grail. But like I said, it's absent legislation. I don't see it happening, right? Okay. And then the rest of it, some other interesting things. So when you go down, it talks about if data produced have property facts, but control access to those facts. Okay, if you're controlling access to facts, then you're probably not on a public blockchain. I mean, that's the whole nature of public blockchains, that it's completely open and transparent. So maybe it's a private blockchain, IBM Hyperledger, something like that. Or maybe it's just hashes on the public blockchain that just says, okay, if you want the data. So what's on the public, what's transparent is someone saying, I have data on this property. But if you want access to it, you're going to have to pay me, or you're going to have to come through me in some fashion. I guess. I don't really know what the value of that is. and talking about RESO, unique identifiers, etc., in which Sam, as CEO of RESO, makes perfect sense. But here, before we go here, let me point something out. As he says right here, why does it have to be blockchain? He says it doesn't. This all works in traditional system with a centralized authority. And then he notes the following: if you trust the authority to be correct all the time, if you trust the authority not to change historical records while you're not looking, if you trust the authority to be available at all times, update or record retrieval. He is absolutely like on the money and very, very close to like the whole core central thesis behind blockchain, which is decentralization. I think he gets it. And yet there's a curious blind spot. And here's what I mean by that. This is RESO's end user agreement. They have an end user license agreement for the universal public identifier number. I think that's what it is. UPIN, property identifier, right? And they talks about universal property identifier repository. Okay, so the idea is that RESO would form and launch this repository and have a bunch of people, title companies, agents, MLSs contribute data into it. But here's the thing. They have a license agreement where they specifically talk about RESO owns RESO products, except for any intellectual property licensed by members. RESO owns all intellectual property in RESO products, like the UPI. RESO in its sole discretion may at any time modify a RESO product for any reason or no reason. So if you were to use this UPI as a blockchain entrepreneur, you go use it, you put your number on it, whatever. RESO could change that. That's highly centralized. That's exactly this. If you trust the authority, sure, maybe I trust RESO today because Sam's the CEO and I know most of the people in it. I think, oh, this is a nonprofit trying to do good work. But then I still have to trust that they're not going to change that system. I have to trust that they're not going to modify UPI. I have to trust them to slap some giant licensing fee on using UPI. Why would I do that? Right? So one of the challenges here, and this is very common when you talk real estate and blockchain, in my opinion. You go to the blockchain world, you talk decentralization, you understand that that's what it's about, and you're saying, okay, we need to try and take the power and the authority away from other centralized authorities who are far less efficient, like the government. But then we are going to centralize it, right? And like, I don't know if that works, right? If RESO and Sam really wanted to try and make something like this happen, I would suggest the first thing they need to do is drop their EULA. The first thing they need to do is open source the entire goddamn thing, right? I mean, why mess with it? Just take all of it. Don't assert some proprietary claim. Just go use one of the public licensing, open sourcing licenses and just put it out there into the public domain. That way, if people do want to build something like this, they don't have to worry about RESO itself changing its mind, changing its products, changing its code. I'm like, that's not a blockchain issue. That's just a kind of an open source trust issue, right? So there's that, right? Let's see. And then we could go to the altruistic data provider model, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think that's necessarily deeply relevant to the point that I'm making. So what is the point that I'm making? The point that I'm making is title as it exists today sucks. There's no doubt. This is not a US phenomenon. This is a global phenomenon. Why? Because every government asserts authority and power over land. I mean, you're literally not a government if you don't control land, right? So as a government, I find it very difficult to imagine that they're ever going to surrender that control, right? So even if the government were to embrace something like putting title on the blockchain, I feel pretty certain in thinking they're going to do this through some private blockchain that they control. Right? This notion of like multiple nodes and every user and participant can just get a full download, full copy of the database. I just don't see that happening because that's the government giving up far too much control over one of its core sort of central identity pieces, which is you control territory, right? I think it's far less, in fact, I think it's far more likely that the government will give up control over its currency before they give up control over its land. Right. So there's that. But even if we were to then say, okay, look, we're still going to trust the government, right? I mean, the government is the ultimate authority. What we want to do, though, is build this layer of universal whatever information that kind of adds onto and puts context behind the government data, and also helps the government make sure that the data in its public records is more accurate, right? It's more correct. Okay. And we want to use the blockchain for that. Okay. Then the next step you have to take on is that additional layer. If it is centralized, then why would you use blockchain? Right? If it's centralized, why would you use blockchain, number one? And number two, if you're in the blockchain space, why would you want that? Why would you want to be forced into trusting some centralized authority, even if you think they're as wonderful as RESO? Even if you love your local MLS and you trust them completely, why would you want that? As opposed to what the blockchain really enables, which is total decentralization. And like Sam pointed out, literally every single person can set up a node and get a full copy of the blockchain. Right? It's just a question. A third, the final sort of, I don't even know where to put this, I guess. It's a little bit too technical. But this sort of explanation of how the blockchain will work, with full nodes, everyone having their own full nodes, and then the whole immutability, the distributed ledger, it sort of implies a layer one blockchain. Right? What I mean by that is, so there's layer one, layer two. There's different types of blockchains, right? Most of the ones that we've all heard of are called layer ones because they really operate their own blockchain. And then other people build on top of that. So like Ethereum is a layer one blockchain. Solana is layer one. Bitcoin is a layer one. Whereas layer twos are sort of new types of blockchains that sit on top of layer ones to do certain things, like make things faster, make things cheaper. So Polygon is a layer two that sits on top of Ethereum. I suppose this could be a layer two that sits on top of, a layer one. But to have this notion of full nodes, you have to have validators or miners. You have to have computers that are out there, sort of validating all of the blocks that are being written, whether that's through proof of work or proof of stake. A lot of that, once you're at that point, it sort of implies a layer one, right? It sort of implies a native token that's going to be used for gas, that's going to be used to reward the companies that keep full nodes and do things like validating, do things like mining. Is that real estate? I mean, maybe. Like if we're on that path, then the conversation shouldn't really be around all this, just like the utility of all no, the conversation then needs to be around that there being a layer one real estate blockchain, right? That has its own native token. Then you have to go set up hundreds, if not thousands, of local validators. And then you have to pick some consensus mechanism, proof of stake, proof of work, proof of history, proof of whatever. You have to come up with something. That work is like multiple billions of dollars in intellectual property. And most of the ones that have done it, they've open sourced that multiple billions of dollars worth of intellectual property. And yeah, maybe. I mean, I've been talking about open source MLS software for 5-6 years, and there's not been any movement towards something like that in real estate. I find it very difficult to imagine the real estate industry moving towards sort of embracing this open source ethos. So to think that we're going to now move to the ultimate like Web3 open source, transparent open data type of framework, I guess I'll say I'll believe it when I see it. I'm having a lot of trouble imagining that happening. So, I mean, I think I'll give Sam this much, this credit. It says right here, big ideas difficult until they aren't. Is it unreasonable to believe some organization would contribute to building this kind of globally valuable initiative? I mean, is it unreasonable? Maybe it's not unreasonable, but I guess I would just ask who, right? Who would build this? And to what end? What's their benefit from doing this? Again, the title companies have, as far as I can tell, zero interest and zero incentive to help build this, or for that matter, to enable it to get built. In fact, I think they would fight it tooth and nail because it would, something like this that exists in the blockchain would destroy the value proposition. So they're going to be against it. Um, public immutable distributed information network. Okay, well, if you're going to distribute this network, then who are the validators, right? Who is going to get compensated to write blocks and validate and verify that these blocks are accurate? Data producer input could be permission via gatekeeper. Full decentralization not a requirement. Well, sure, but then what's the point? If it's not going to be full decentralized, then what's the point of using blockchain? Right? Why not just have RESO launch its own website that says we're going to be the national repository of property information and go from there? But the final question that I would ask behind that is, let's say this happens. Let's say RESO goes out, takes its universal property identifier thing, makes a private blockchain, goes to IBM Hyperledger, create a whatever, and that RESO would control along with 600 nodes, right? So each MLS of the roughly 600, they would all have a full copy, and that's the private network you create and centralize. Cool. What happens next? When then the Housing and Urban Development, department, or FTC, or whoever, the federal government comes to RESO and says, "That's great. We love what you've built here. We're going to take that now," right? And when they say we're going to take it, it's not like they're taking it. It's more like we're going to regulate the shit out of you, and your board of directors will have 6 people that are appointed by the president sitting on it. What do you do then? You do bupkis is what you do, because you're centralized. So when a bigger central authority that has all the guns comes to you and says you're going to come under authority, then that's what happens. Is that worth it? And if it is, why even go through the whole RESO rigmarole? Why not just go to the government and ask them to create a centralized universal property information network? Wouldn't that be a faster shortcut? Because if we're going to live in a centralized world, then let's live in a centralized world, right? So I know it sounded pretty negative about this, but like I said, I really think it's awesome that Sam did put together, some really good thoughts. It's obvious to me that he's really put some thought behind it. It's just that he doesn't take things to the next level. And I felt like if we're going to keep talking about title, going to keep talking about we need property information on blockchain, I'm like, no, that's great. That's cool as hell. But can we get sort of specific, right? And ask that next question, like, who is going to do this? Who benefits? And if it is remain centralized, then why go through all this? Why not just go direct to the FTC, to HUD, and say, please create HUD MLS right now? I mean, it would be a faster way of getting there, right? Since none of that is going to happen, my sense is an idea like this, a big idea, it's not that difficult to do. There's no technical challenge around it, but it's all social, it's all cultural, it's all political. And I think the big one is the political. So until we have some better guidance from either the courts or our legislatures or the city county level, I'm not sure what us sitting here talking about really would make that big of a difference. But again, maybe I'm wrong. It's not me being a skeptic about the technology. As you all know, I'm pretty all in on blockchain. This particular application, though, just has a bunch of hurdles that, as yet, everyone's kind of pointed to the benefits, and very few people have talked about kind of the difficulties and the issues and problems with trying to make this happen with the structure that exists today. So, hey, let me know what you think. And obviously, if you've listened to this point, it's almost a half hour. I'd appreciate if you would click that subscribe button so I could name my channel. Still pretty far from having enough subscribers to be able to do that. So anyway, thanks everyone. Take care.